Welcome to our symposium on making changes, learning from social science research to drive behavior change. My name is Katharina Anton-Erxleben. I am a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, currently serving at USAID, and I am also one of the co-founders and co-chair of the fellowship program's Social Science Affinity Group, which is a network of fellows with an interest in social sciences and how social sciences can be applied in different policy areas. So on behalf of the group, welcome again. We are really excited that so many of you are here. Everyone who has ever broken a New Year's resolution knows that making changes is really, really hard, even in your own life. But many of us in our work are trying in one way or another to influence changes in behavior for a greater good. And I'm sure you all appreciate how much more difficult it can be to break with long-standing norms and traditions at the level of a group or a society, whether you're working on climate change, health, or are trying to fight discrimination or to counter violent extremism. We designed this symposium to provide an opportunity to learn from the social sciences about making approaches to behavior change better, to bridge theory and practice, to connect researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and to identify successful practices and lessons learned across sectors. In organizing this symposium, we worked in collaboration with the fellowship's affinity groups on energy and climate, health policy, global health, biodiversity, STEM diversity, and women of color in STEM. So first of all, I'd like to give a big thank you to our organizing team. Can everyone who helped organize just quickly stand up for a moment? Thank you. And then I also want to give a big shout out to Kristen Fusco and Eddie Gonzalez at AAAS, who have really done a fantastic job over the past 6 months or so in supporting us with this effort. Thank you, Eddie and Kristen. So we have a really exciting lineup of speakers, and I can't wait to hear their presentations. But before we dive into the program, I do have a couple of announcements to make. So in your copy of the program, you should find all the information you need on the individual sessions, breaks, etc., internet access. Here's also a Twitter hashtag in case you want to tweet about this. And I want to point out that we have set up a nursing room in the green room, which is behind this auditorium, if you should need it. Then I want to announce that applications for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship are now open. And if you're interested, or you know anyone who you think might be interested, you should talk to Eddie at the registration table. Last but not least, I want to note that many of us fellows who are speakers today are working in different federal agencies. But today we are here as fellows and are not speaking on behalf of those agencies. And with that, I will give the floor to Janetta, who is going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to see this auditorium again. I was a fellow last year, and I'm really happy to see new faces and old faces. So today, I just couldn't be happier to introduce Dr. Tim Wilson, who will help us to kick off this exciting day of stimulating talks and discussions on behavioral change. Dr. Wilson is the Sherrell J. Aston Professor of Psychology of the University of Virginia, and he is a highly regarded social psychologist inside and outside of the psychology community. Just to give you a flavor of how well respected he is, how many of you here have heard of Malcolm Gladwell or read the book Blink? Okay, good. So this is what Malcolm Gladwell said about his book Blink, and it is on his blog. He said that in Blink, I probably own a bigger intellectual debt to Tim Wilson and his longtime collaborator Jonathan Scholar than anyone else. And Strangers to Ourselves, which is Tim's book, is probably the most influential book I've ever read. It also inspired 2 separate New Yorker articles of mine, Getting Over It and Personality Plus. So within the psychology community, Dr. Wilson is well known for his intriguing and insightful work that often makes you question your assumptions about how human minds work, and also our common explanations about why people do the thing that they do. So for example, you would think that if I asked you to just do nothing and just think, you would quite enjoy the experience. But his recent work show that actually people are quite aversive to just do nothing and just think. And people are rather to shock themselves than just sitting there and do nothing and think. So, well, after I read the article, I feel like I'm justified at why I couldn't pick up meditations over the years. And I might actually need to take a different approach. Okay? So when we think about behavioral change, his work really shows that we can't just rely on our intuitions about human behavior and motivations. We need to rely on science to test these assumptions. And I'm sure that he will also tell you need to test your intervention. And through this process of understanding the psychological underpinning of behavior, we may discover new and surprising ways to bring about behavioral change for the social good. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Dr. Tim Wilson, who will talk to us about his research on his book called Redirect. And his topic today is Redirect, Changing People's Behavior by Editing Their Stories.
I feel like I'm kind of settling in for a trip on an airplane or something. I've got my water, my clicker. I think I'm all set. Well, thank you so much, Janetta, for the nice introduction. It's wonderful to be here on this really important topic, which is dear to my heart, something I have thought about over the years, about changing behavior. And today I want to tell you about an approach I think is unique and is rooted in social psychology. So let me jump right in. The theme of the day is can people change? And if so, how? On this slide, I just listed a bunch of behaviors that psychologists and others have looked at that are a bunch of problems that are rooted in behavioral change, at least to some extent. I mean, obviously, our health, many health problems are rooted in things we do, our behavior, and so on down the list. And what these have in common is that people act in ways that have negative consequences for them or others. And the question is, how can we change their behavior? Now, I think there's sort of 2 traditional answers to this question of behavior change. One, in the red circle, is we need to address the person. There's something wrong with the person, him or herself. They don't have the requisite skills or traits or motivation. And so that's where we need to focus our efforts. The blue circle says, well, that may be, but we also need to consider the environment that that person's in. We need to improve schools. We need to attack poverty. We need to get jobs for people. And it's no accident that I've colored these circles red and blue, because they have been traditionally associated with the political spectrum. That the conservative approach is generally to focus on the person. We need to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. If people are having problems, well, they need to try harder, something along those lines. Whereas the liberal ideology is more, we need to take the environmental approach and somehow make it more amenable to behavior change. I actually think there's some truth with both of those. I've kind of characterized them. I mean, I think it almost is obvious that sometimes people need to, they don't have the requisite skills or ability or motivation, and obvious that sometimes the environment places huge barriers in the way of behavior change. But the approach I want to tell you about today is a third one. And it says, yes, it's not denying that both of those are laudable goals, to change people and the environment. But what the social psychologist says is, let's look at how people perceive the environment and themselves. We have to look at their construals of of their situation, their own explanation or interpretation of why things are the way they are. Now, just to give you a little bit of history, Kurt Lewin is generally thought of as the father of social psychology, and he made some really important points. One is this power of construals, how we view the situation in ourselves, as opposed to some measure of objective reality. We can develop theories, psychological theories, to try to change people's construals. We have to test them with the experimental method. And as you'll see, it may be possible, at least in certain situations, to change people's construals with relatively simple interventions in ways that have big payoffs down the road. Just, I'm not sure you need convincing of this, but about the power of construals. It's certainly true in perception. There's a long philosophical tradition that the world is not out there, it's how we perceive the world, and there are many famous optical illusions to show that, such as the famous duck-rabbit optical illusion. Is that a photo of a rabbit looking to the right or a duck looking to the left? Well, it's neither. It's just how you are perceiving it in any given moment. And the social psychological view is that same principle applies more broadly to how we perceive the world around us. And I use this metaphor of stories the word construal is rather cumbersome after all. And so I use as a metaphor this idea of stories, that we all have stories that we tell ourselves about why we do what we do, who we are, what the world around us is like. And these are powerful determinants of our behavior. Now, by using that metaphor, there's some danger of conveying that this is a highly conscious thing where we sit down each morning and say, okay, what's my story for today? And although I think we do have some awareness of what our stories are, they're not entirely. I think they're often quick assumptions we make about ourselves that are hugely important as to what we do. Just to give you one example, if you're fans of This American Life, you may have heard of this guy. He was featured in a recent episode. His name's Daniel Kish. And when he was 13 months old, he had a congenital disease that made him totally blind. Now, what's interesting about this story is his mother decided that she was going to treat him like any other child. Wasn't going to treat him like someone with a disability, but just treat him the same way she would as if he were a sighted individual. She let him ride a bicycle. She let him go out in the neighborhood by himself. This led to many mishaps where he would run into things, but he because of his mother's expectations, he developed his own view, or story, if you will, that he did not have a disability, that he could do anything anyone else could. And to a large extent, this became true. He developed a form of echolocation where he could click his tongue. He's still alive. He does click his tongue, and he can hear the sound waves coming back in ways that allows him to navigate through the world. He can, in fact, ride a bike. He goes on hikes in the woods. If you were to meet him, you might not even realize that he was blind. And it just is one example of the power of the story, that by adopting a view that he wasn't blind, in some sense, he isn't blind. They've even done MRI studies on him to show that this echolocation he's developed activates the visual cortex in the brain, that he's developed a substitute for sight, if you will. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not denying that, of course, the objective world matters. I'm not trying to say it's all in our heads. But just what I want to try to convince you of is the power of this story. And indeed, by using this metaphor, we can develop some really interesting interventions to change behavior. There are, just to point out, for some of you who know these literatures, there are other words for this. I'm using stories very generally to include what some people call mindsets or construals or attributions. And again, I think I'm kind of repeating myself here, but this can lead to relatively small interventions that pay off with big behavior change. Okay, let me give you an example. I've been talking kind of abstractly. And I'll do so from an old study of mine. My goal today is really just to sort of pick from the literature various examples of interventions that use this story metaphor to show you the breadth of what can be done. And I'll begin with one of mine that's done many years ago. And the idea we had was, why is it that some college students fall off the bus? That they come to college and they run into difficulties. They were very talented in high school, but they just don't do well. Now, one explanation is that, well, maybe there were admissions errors. Somehow they don't have what it takes. That's kind of the person view. The other is, well, no, maybe there's something wrong with this environment that they're in. But the social psychological view is, no, let's look at their understanding or construal of their situation. So here's a woman, and let's say, for the sake of the argument, that she's in her freshman year and she does really badly on her first calculus test. She gets a D. And the way she explains it to herself is to say, her construal, her story, is that, you know, it just goes to show that I can't make it here. I guess I'm not college material. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it will lead to giving up. A lot of stress, less effort, and that can be self-fulfilling because the more she convinces herself that she can't make it in this environment, the less she'll try. That will lead to further poor performance, which reinforces this view that she can't make it here. But imagine another student, let's say that she gets the exact same poor grade on the exact same test, but she has a very different explanation, a more self-enhancing one. She says, well, I guess this is a wake-up call. Maybe I learned I need to approach this differently. Maybe I need to learn different study skills. I need to go to the professor's office hours. I need to double down and really try harder. And that construal or story leads to more effort, and hopefully it pays off with a better grade on the next test, and that confirms that more positive explanation. So the point of the study we did is, how can we take a student who is in the exacerbation cycle of thinking and bump her over to the more positive explanation? So we tried this really pretty simple study. The participants were first-year college students who indeed were not doing well, and were concerned about it. And the so-called story prompting group, by that term I mean a group we were trying to change their explanation, we brought them into the psych building one by one. We never told them that we were trying to change them in any particular way. They just thought they were taking part in a survey. And we gave them some information that just suggested that, you know, lots of people struggle in their first year of college, but it gets better. We gave them some statistics indicating that grades often get better after the first year. And to reinforce this, we showed them some videotaped interviews of older students who said that, yeah, you know, my first year was kind of a disaster, but I'm really doing fine now academically, to drive this message home. This took about 30 minutes. A control group, randomly assigned, of course, came in and answered some survey questions, but didn't get this information about academic performance. So then we tracked them to see whether this would have any impact on them. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, how would a 30-minute intervention, would we even expect that this would have any impact on their lives? But our assumption was that sometimes it's a little, if you're in a kind of fork of the road in your story, you could go down that exacerbation cycle, a negative cycle of thinking, or with a little bump you can get into that self-enhancing cycle. Maybe this would have some impact. And we were pleased that it did. This is the difference in their grades between their, at the end of their sophomore year compared to their freshman year on a 4-point grade scale. So you can see that the group that got our little intervention improved their grades about 0.3 on a 4-point grade scale. So, you know, we're not turning C students into A students, but it was an increase, whereas our people who in the control condition showed a slight decrease in grades. That was a significant difference. And somewhat to our surprise, this also showed up in retention in college, that those in the control condition, a full 25% had dropped out of college by the sophomore year, whereas this was reduced to only 5% in the story condition. So that is one example of this so-called story editing approach, where the attempts are with brief interventions to try to get people into a better way of viewing their situation, with the idea that we can start small and hopefully scale up these interventions. And there are 4 kinds of story editing interventions I want to touch on today. 2 of them, the first 2 are those that other people can do to try to change someone else's story. The second 2 are approaches that we can do ourselves to try to change our own stories. So let me begin with the idea of labeling. That the idea of labeling is simple. You just give someone a different label for their situation. It's very direct. You just say, maybe this is the way you should look at this situation. It often works well with children who may not know exactly how to interpret a particular behavior. And indeed, there is some evidence that this works. So if you take elementary school children and they do something like pick up a piece of trash in the classroom, if you label that for them as, oh, you're a helpful person, that actually is internalized, and they begin to view themselves as helpful people. The same with kids who get caught doing something bad. If you label that, they can interpret that a variety of ways. They could say, darn, I got caught, or ooh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And indeed, if you label it for them as you must be feeling kind of guilty now, they internalize that, and it leads to better behavior subsequently. This approach, I think, is less effective with adults. We're a little more savvy about just taking a label from someone else. Although there is one study that suggests that it might work there as well. It's a recent study done to increase voter turnout in elections. Registered voters in New Jersey were called the day before a gubernatorial election, and they were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, which are subtly different, but importantly so. In one condition, they said to people, do you plan to vote in tomorrow's election? Using vote as a verb. In the other, they said, do you plan to be a voter in tomorrow's election? Now, you may wonder, that's a pretty subtle difference. What possible difference could it make? But their theory was that the act of voting is something, well, we could or could not do. But being a voter ties this act to our identity. Most of us want to be good citizens who think highly of ourselves as participating in the political process. And if you phrase it to me as, do I plan to be a voter tomorrow? Well, sure, I'm a good citizen. I'm a good person. This is something I want to do. And indeed, when they check the voter registration, the voter rolls sometime later to see who actually did vote, there was an 11% increase in such, which may not seem like a big difference, but if you're a political candidate in a close election, that could determine the outcome. So as an example of labeling, where giving people this label of you are a voter has an impact. Well, I want to spend a little more time on this approach of story prompting, because I think it's something that many recent attempts I've used successfully to change behavior. It involves pretty direct instruction, where you tell people, you're giving them information that implies maybe they should look at something a little differently. Often that involves testimonials from others, as in the study we did with college freshmen, where you're listening to others talk about their experience. I would include in this a social norms approach, where you're finding out on average what other people do, so that it might inform you as to how to interpret your situation. And I've already given you one example from the college freshman study, but let me give you some more. And again, I've tried to pick examples that are very different kinds of problems to show that this approach, you can get traction on many different ones. And this particular study, which is one of my favorites, not one that I did, was looking at how to reduce child abuse. And obviously, a tragic problem in this country, which is far too common. It was done by Daphne Busenthal and her colleagues at UC Santa Barbara. Now, one thing Busenthal noticed is this odd pattern of explanation where parents who abuse their children often blame their children for acting out. They have this tendency to say, oh, he was crying because he was angry at me or out to get me or something, pretty kind of pathological along those lines. And so the question, she said, is, well, maybe it would help just to intervene at that level, trying to get parents who are potential or at risk for child abuse to come up with a different explanation of why their children are acting out. So the participants, and this has been replicated a number of times, are at-risk parents who have just had a baby, at risk for child abuse by a number of measures, including possibly having been abused themselves. And they took part in a program, an ongoing program, in which a home visitor would come to their homes 20 times over the year to help them with parenting skills. Now, this program, which exists in almost all states, has not been shown to be particularly successful by itself. But what Bischenthal did is randomly assign the home visitors to one of two conditions. In one, they did their normal job of giving parenting advice, but they also looked for opportunities to get the parents to reinterpret reasons why their kids are acting out. So if they were in the home and they have a toddler who is misbehaving or crying, they'd ask the parents, why they thought that was, and indeed, the parents often came up with these blaming the child explanations. Oh, he's just mad at me today. And using a kind of a Socratic approach, the home visitor would try to prompt other explanations. So, well, that's interesting. Can you think of other reasons why he might be crying? And eventually, most of the parents could come up with an explanation that was something less blaming of the child and more easy to fix, like, maybe he needs a nap, or maybe I didn't burp my baby enough, or whatever. And the home visitor would reinforce this less pejorative explanation. Now, again, this is pretty subtle. Over the course of the year, these home visits looking for these opportunities to redirect an explanation from a negative one to a more positive one. Did it have an effect? Well, there was, as I mentioned, a control group that was randomly assigned not to get this intervention. And after a year, if we look at the percent of families where there were evidence of abuse, it went from 24 or 5% in the control group and dropped to near 0 in the story prompting group. Obviously, reports of abuse can be difficult to interpret. Bischenthal and her colleagues often also have other measures, such as cortisol levels in the child. Cortisol is a hormone which can be a sign of stress. And indeed, those who got the story prompting intervention, the children the infants themselves showed less evidence of stress. Okay, moving on to another example, another one of my studies we did a few years ago. And again, I'm just picking from kind of all over the map of kinds of behavioral problems. And one is reducing prejudice. Social psychologists know from years of study that one of the best ways to reduce hostility between groups is increasing contact between those groups under just the right conditions. But what psychologists haven't looked at so much is how to get people to do that. That often there's a reluctance to cross lines and initiate interactions between someone who may be different from you. In college environments, people tell us, for example, we surveyed white students at the University of Virginia who admitted to us, most of them, that, we said, what would it be like to have a conversation with an African-American student who you don't know? Say you just were put in a room and asked to chat with this person for 10 minutes. And many of the white students said, I think it might be a little awkward. I might say the wrong thing. We might not have much in common. And they admitted to us, not everyone, but many, that they'd be more comfortable talking with another white student. Well, it turns out they were wrong. When we asked people to actually do this and have these conversations, they reported to us that they went just fine if they were with someone of another race. And it wasn't just that they were telling us that. We had measures of nonverbal behavior, and with their permission, we videotaped these interviews. And it turns out that it was easier than they thought to find something in common to talk about. And after all, we put two strangers together. We're all motivated to make it go as well as we can. There are two students at the same university. They can find something in common to talk about. And so the conclusion we drew is that people are reluctant to initiate contact sometimes because they have the misperception that it's going to be more awkward than it in fact is likely to be. So that led us to wonder whether we, being Robin Mallett, a postdoc of mine, and me, could we get people to change those expectations as to what these interactions would be like in ways that might break down these barriers. So we did a study in which the participants were white University of Virginia students in their first year and the first 2 weeks of college. And I suspect that's critical, that we were catching people at a time when they're open to making lots of new friends. And we, in this story prompting intervention condition, we brought them into the psych building and we showed them a videotape of a pair of older students who talked about how they had become friends. One was black, one was white. And they talked about how, yeah, they had met their first year. They didn't really think they had that much in common, but it turns out they really did. They both had similar senses of humor and interests, and they've now become best friends. To sort of drive this message home, we also asked people to write about a time when maybe they became friends with someone who they hadn't initially thought they would be compatible with. And what we're trying to do here is change their expectation about, for themselves, as to what such interactions might be like. There was a control group that saw a very similar videotape, but it was between two white students, so they didn't get any information about interracial friendships. So then we sat back and we said, okay, is this going to have any impact on their lives? Are they going to be more open to interracial friendships in their actual life when they leave our building? And we thought about, well, we hope so, but how are we going to measure that? And the first idea we had was we emailed all participants a week after the study, and we said, please write down the initials of anyone you've met in the last week who you think might be a new friend, who you didn't know before, and you might be a new friend. And once I did that, we said, okay, now go back and tell us what race each of these people is. So we were able to calculate the proportion of potential new friends that would be, that were members of a different race. And indeed, we found that the percentage of these potential new friends who were of a different race was almost triple in our condition in which we gave the information that, these kind of relationships can go pretty well. We were really encouraged by this. We worried a little bit that it was just their reports. I mean, after all, maybe these participants kind of scoped out the purpose of our study. Maybe they're just telling us this. Do we really know for sure that they had developed these friendships? So Robin Mallett, my co-author, said, well, there's a way we can find out. Let's check their Facebook pages. Maybe if we look at who their friends are and whether they're also a University of Virginia student, and then we can, just by looking at their pictures, try to deduce their race. And I said, Robin, this is never going to work. I mean, if you think about it, many of these people may have been their prior friends. We don't know that they were made in the next, during the time period we're interested in. It's a noisy, but well, if you want to try. So Robin got everyone's permission to check their Facebook pages and diligently coded how many friends they had at the University of Virginia that were of a different race. And I'll be darned if it didn't work. It's not as big a difference, but it is statistically reliable that those in our story prompt condition had more friends on their Facebook page of a different race at their university than those in our control condition. Okay, so again, just to remind you where we are, we're in story prompting kinds of interventions where researchers usually fairly subtly try to get people to explain their situation or come up with a little different story than they had before, with the hope that that ripples in a way that leads to big behavior change. Another example, the achievement gap in college. It's well known that African American and other racial minorities don't do as well in college as majority students. It's well known that often they don't complete college as much. The same is true of first-generation college students of any race. And Greg Lawton and Jeff Cohen thought, one reason for this, and particularly at majority white universities, that it's a psychological issue of coming into an environment where you don't feel that you belong as much as a white student might feel. And one reason for that is there may be a kind of misattribution of common experiences. So imagine you're in your first semester at college, and the weekend rolls around, it's a Friday or Saturday night, and you're sitting in your room, and no one has asked you to do anything that weekend. So you're sitting there by yourself. Now, if you're a white student, the idea is you might say, oh, well, I guess I didn't make enough effort. Maybe I should try to make friends. Maybe I could call up someone myself and see if they want to go to a movie. But if you're a minority student who already feels like this isn't a particularly welcoming environment, you might make a very different explanation and say, is this another sign that I don't fit in here, that this isn't the place for me? And so Walton and Cohen decided to change that explanation, see if they could, to convince African-American students that there are other ways to interpret this. You don't have to interpret it in this negative way. So the participants, they looked at both white and black first-year students at a highly selective, majority white college. And they randomly assigned half of them to the so-called belongingness intervention. So if they're in that condition, they read survey results indicating that many older students had this reaction their first year. They felt like they didn't belong, but then it got better. Like some of my studies, they wrote essays about how their experiences were similar. And they were asked to give a speech, a videotaped speech that will be shown to future students that that confirms this point, that yes, many people feel like they don't belong, but really everyone goes through this, and you just need to adjust. All of these were designed, now again, like many of these studies, these students didn't know that the researchers were trying to change them. They thought they were just taking a part in a psychology study. And, but all these messages were designed to change their explanation of their own situation in a more positive way. There was a control group that didn't get any of this information. This took about an hour. And the question is, okay, is this going to have any effect? It didn't have any effect for the white students, which was actually what the researchers predicted, that the white students, the idea is, already know this. They already know that, well, if no one's called me up on a Friday night to do anything, that's not a sign that this is a hostile environment for me necessarily. It's a sign that, maybe I should call someone, or I need to try a little harder to make friends. But it had dramatic effects for the black students. So all the slides I'm going to show you with these graphs is for the African-American students only. And it's a little confusing. Sometimes high means good and sometimes high means bad. So bear with me. This measure is directly asking them, well, how uncertain are you about how you belong at this university? So high means you're really uncertain. That's bad. Low means, no, I do think I belong at this university. And indeed, those who got this belongingness story prompt, that got this information suggesting that many people experienced this at first, they felt that they now felt they belonged more at this university. And that's pretty good. Oh, I missed a crucial detail. This measure came 3 years later in their senior year in college. What about their grades in their senior year? Those who got this 1 hour belongingness intervention in their freshman year got significantly better grades. Again, it's about the same magnitude as my earlier study. It's not huge, but it is statistically reliable. And after all, this is a 1 hour intervention that led to this. Health, not something they predicted, but they asked people in their senior year, how many times have you been to the doctor in the previous month? And a statistically significant difference for those who had gotten this belongingness intervention had fewer visits to the doctor, and they reported that they were happier. All of this is consistent with the idea that these students too are maybe at this narrative fork in the road where you have these bad experiences your first year. There's a variety of ways you can interpret them. If you go down that negative path, it's self-fulfilling, and you're not going to end up in a happy place. But if you go down the better path, better things happen. Okay, those are my examples of story prompts. There's also a number of writing exercises that have been developed to help people change their own stories. I've listed several here, but I'm only going to have time to talk about a fairly recent one by Cross and Iduk. And, excuse me. In this study, they asked all their participants to think of an event where they felt overwhelming anger and hostility, which unfortunately everyone could do. They then randomly assigned them to write about that event in one of 4 ways in a 2x2 design. Half were asked to write about it from the first or third person perspective. So in the first person perspective, write about how you experienced it. In the third person, take the perspective of someone else. Imagine you're a fly on the wall, observing this event that made you so angry, and write about that. Crossing that, half the people were asked to focus on their feelings, how they felt, and the others to take a more distant approach of why they felt that way. Now, what they expected is that one of these 4 conditions would work the best at getting them to take a kind of dispassionate look and reconstrue the situation in a way that makes them feel better. And you can probably guess which one it is. If I'm focusing on my feelings, I relive this event. Why was I feeling angry? But if I focus on why, it enables me to maybe be a little more objective and come up with a different explanation, particularly if I'm taking that third-person perspective. So what they predicted was third-person perspective who was writing about why this event occurred should lead to the best reduction in anger. And that is indeed what was found, that they felt the least anger after this writing. And this seems to be mediated by, if they look at what people write, by reconstruing, coming up with a different explanation, a different story, if you will, about why this event occurred in a way that enables you to move beyond it. This result's been replicated with a number of both physiological and psychological measures, and with different kinds of emotional states. The so-called do good, be good approach is also one of my favorites. The idea here is it's a rock-solid social psychological principle. If you want to change people, often change their behavior first, and then their stories will follow. I'll tell you about one such study. There's a number of them. And it is a program that has been designed to be done in high schools to reduce teenage pregnancy. Now, there is evidence that sex education works, particularly if you tell kids about birth control. And unlike some claims, this does not increase sexual activity. But these researchers took a different approach. And they're thinking about this at the level of the story. What might lead a teen to engage in dangerous activities such as unprotected sex? And the research shows, perhaps not surprisingly, that those teens who feel kind of alienated, they're not a part of their community, they feel disengaged, are the ones who are most apt to who do dangerous things. So, how can we intervene to change those stories? They did a large-scale study where they randomly assigned classrooms to either undergo their regular health class or do volunteer work in their community over the course of a year. And the kids committed to doing at least a couple hours of volunteer work in an agency of their choice. It could be a homeless shelter, it could be a daycare center, what have you. And now you might wonder, okay, what does this have to do with pregnancy? Getting kids to do volunteer work? Well, the idea is change their behavior and stories will follow. If you can make kids feel a part of their community, to feel like they now have a stake, someone is depending on them, this guy at the senior center that they visit every week. That may lead to change in their own views, which lead to better behaviors. And indeed, if you look at the percentage of girls who got pregnant, that was significantly lower in those who did the volunteer work, and it also rippled into academic success. These were done at pretty high-risk schools, and in a control group there was a lot of academic failure, less so in the volunteer program. Now, what do all the examples I've said to you today have in common? Again, it's our stories that matter. You can redirect these stories based on social psychological theory, and that small nudges can lead to self-sustaining change. And I want to emphasize, you'll know that every single one of these interventions was tested with an experiment with random assignment, which I can't emphasize too much, that how important it is to do this with an experiment. And just as a very quick aside, I'll mention a few programs that you've probably heard of, at least some of them, that didn't take this approach. They were implemented throughout America before they were put to the test. Such as, let's skip ahead here, Healthy Families America is a program that has home visits to help child abuse. It's the one that piggybacks on the intervention by Busenthal et al. The DARE drug program, both my kids went through it. Somewhere in New Georgia probably still have DARE t-shirts. Critical Incident Stress Management, a program to help people who have experienced traumatic events by getting them to relive it right afterwards. Scared Straight programs. None of these programs work. In Healthy Families America's defense, there's some recent evidence suggesting it may have some positive effects, but there's also other studies that show it doesn't. All of these programs were instituted widely before they were tested. Scared Straight is one of the best examples because, you know, not only does it not help prevent crimes to take kids to prisons and have hardened criminals yell at them, it actually increases criminal activity. It's true. There have now been 7 studies that randomly assigned kids to go through this or not. Every single one found an increase in crime in the group that did it. The reasons for this aren't entirely clear. We can talk about it if you want, but it's actually pretty tragic that these programs are in place without being tested. Where are we now? You know, I've given you just a few examples. There are dozens of these kinds of story editing interventions, wide range of problems. What's next? Well, I think we need some more theoretical work to see exactly what's mediating the change in these studies. We make a lot of assumptions about stories changing. Evidence for that, we could probably do more work there. But you also notice that all the examples I gave you are pretty small scale, often involving 100 people. And there's no accident to that. I think the assumption of this approach is instead of applying something massively like Scared Straight, and start small and make sure we're not doing harm, and we have some idea of that we're on the right track, of something that works. Obviously, we're interested in scaling up these interventions if they do work. That can have some issues associated with it. Does a program that's been developed in this one college, is that going to generalize to all colleges or to all high schools or what have you? There are also practical issues. There are issues of funding, of how to fund such interventions. But my advice here is that whatever we do in scaling them up, we have to continue to test them experimentally. We can't assume that what works in one setting is now going to work just the same in a very different setting. That we have to keep on our hats as researchers who are willing to assign people to control groups, because only then will we know if we can successfully scale up these programs. Just a few examples that are going on now that I think are pretty exciting. A group at Stanford has developed a website called CURPS, which any teacher in America can go to and have her students receive an intervention designed to improve their mindsets, as long as the teachers agree to do this as an experiment, where the kids will get randomly assigned, and to share the grades that the students get, de-anonymized, of course. Another group of researchers, some overlap, are now doing a national study of Carol Dweck's mindsets interventions in a nationally representative sample of high schools to see if convincing children that intelligence is something that grows rather than is fixed will work on a national scale. The belongingness intervention I mentioned that was done by Walton and Cohen, they are now generalizing this to colleges throughout America. They currently have about a dozen colleges that have agreed to use this intervention much more widely as an experiment. There will be control groups. And the Carnegie Foundation is doing educational interventions as well. And all of these have in common that they're based on small-scale, well-done experimental studies and now being scaled up more broadly. Much work to do. I hope my enthusiasm for this has come through. I think these are really exciting times in social psychology. It's not the perfect approach to everything, but I think there's a lot of potential to apply this to a wide variety of problems. So can people change? My answer is yes, if we get just the right leverage to enable them to do so. Thank you very much. And there's my book.
So I guess we have about 10 minutes to do questions. There are microphones in the back, and please feel free to come up and ask questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was super interesting. I'm really interested in the categories for generalized movements across these different studies. And as you were talking, I was wondering if one of them is just the idea of giving people an example of what they should do versus what they shouldn't do, and if you could comment on that a little bit more. Like the example of scared straight is saying, don't become a criminal. But your other examples of labeling a child as be helpful or have friends that are of different races. So anything you could say that's more on the categories would be really interesting.
Well, that's an interesting question. Is what they have in common giving an example of good behavior? I suspect it's more than that. Telling a teenager you shouldn't get pregnant or you should get good grades, I think is well, if any of you have teenagers, you know that doesn't always work. I think the key is getting a little bit underneath the behavior to the explanation of why. But it is this construal that really is critical as to why I might do one of these behaviors. What it means for me as a person, what kind of identity issues are at stake, how I explain this. I think that's what's really key, is at least my guess. Yes?
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the narrative fork in the road. And I wonder if you can speak to how you decided when was the best time to make that intervention. A lot, the stories that you told were all successful, and you were able to intervene early on. Are there examples where the intervention happened too late and there wasn't the effect? So comment about the timing of those interventions.
That's a really important question, and I think we don't fully know the answer to it yet. I think it's no accident that many of these studies are done with younger people at times when their identities aren't fully formed. First year of college, many are done in middle school years when kids are negotiating their identity as to who they are. But there haven't been enough really good studies that have looked at that systematically, just to compare across age groups. I think this national mindset study is going to help in that, where they're looking at different ages, different kinds of kids, to see whether they can identify who is likely to change, is most susceptible to this kind of change. But I guess the best I can tell you is my hunch, and I do think that there is evidence that as we age, our beliefs become more solidified, but we need more work there. Yes?
Hi. Thank you for that. I feel like I'm back in your class at UVA. But I was wondering, has anybody tried to do similar studies like across cultures and the whole range of internationally? And if not, or if so, do you have thoughts on whether it would work?
I hope so. There isn't a lot of work. There's one I can think of that Carol Dweck and some colleagues have done, looking at Israelis and Palestinians and their views of how easily beliefs can change based on your ethnicity, and giving them some feedback that beliefs aren't fixed things but can change, actually reduce at least reported hostilities in the Middle East. But I don't know of many other examples. I mean, I'm fairly confident that this metaphor of the story is cross-culturally valid. Obviously, the nature of the story and beliefs about change and which story is most effective in which culture, fascinating area, but not enough work yet. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. That was very interesting. There's something that's intrigued me for a long time, and you touched on it a little bit in your talk, so I wonder if you could tell me if there's any work in this area or comment on how you've seen it yourself. And that is changing something that is very intimately a part of your identity. And the example I give, I have wonderful colleagues, brilliant, great ideas, but they communicate the message in the most offensive way possible. And they have seen, or not always, but let's just say they're not always tactful and diplomatic, and they just get the message out. And they can themselves see the effect they're having on other people. And I will communicate the same message in a friendly way. And I'm trying to get them to change their behavior. And I have failed utterly with several of these kinds of things. And I came to the conclusion it's because a big part of how they view themselves is someone who's direct. Can you comment on that?
Well, is your colleague here? You know, I don't want to oversell this approach. There are obviously times when we have issues with our identity and our stories that are pretty deep-seated, and sometimes a little intervention isn't going to work. Maybe a bigger intervention, such as psychotherapy. I say that I'm a fan of psychotherapy. I think particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, one of its goals is to get people to change their negative thinking in ways that are beneficial. So it's sort of what dose you need, I guess. There are sometimes we need a much bigger dose of story rearrangement than in these studies. So obviously I can't speak to your colleague, but if it is something that's central to his or her identity that goes back years of family history, then maybe something bigger is called for. What excites me about this approach is to suggest that isn't always true. There are at least at times, maybe at certain ages, where a lighter dose can have a pretty big effect.
Is there time for one more question? Yeah, so the last two questions, I'm just switching over because we don't have a break in between. So keep asking. Okay, great. So some of the interventions that you talked about asked the participants to come up with their own alternative narratives. For example, the child abuse one, and some of the writing exercises. Yes. And then others, it sounded like, didn't have that as part of the design. Do you see a difference when people are asked to sort of come up with their own alternative stories compared to when they're told an alternative story?
That's a really interesting question. The child abuse one, they were being led down a path gently by the home visitor, so they weren't totally on their own. In fact, I think they couldn't have done it totally on their own. But you're quite right that the writing exercises, people are left to their own devices to do it, and these are often older people who have a variety of problems, and if you give them enough, in the right conditions, they're able to do it. So. I actually haven't thought too much about how to compare those. There's no study I know of that directly compared the two. I think that, but you're quite right that in the writing exercises, they're banking on the fact that with the right perspective, people can do it on their own. Whether that would work in some of these other studies, I don't know.
Good morning. You mentioned in your presentation to pursue more experimental methods, different ones compared to the control versus uncontrolled. Can you expand upon that and also kind of subdivide it such that which ones would be the most appropriate for your smaller scale studies compared to your larger scale studies?
Well, this is kind of a pet issue of mine, and there's no doubt sometimes it's very hard to do it as an experiment. There are some kinds of interventions that if you're interviewing, say, at the level of school, there are a lot of tricky issues as to how to do it. But I think we often give up too easily. We often say, oh, we can't do this as an experiment. So, I would say any intervention, you should start by thinking, is there any possible way I can do this as an RCT with a control group? Sometimes you can't. You have to do sort of quasi-experimental things. But I think we give up too easily sometimes in that. And so, I guess the short answer is, if we can, we should never do the other approach. We can have a long discussion about this. As I know, many of you are out there in the trenches doing interventions, and it's very hard sometimes. But I think it's at least a conversation we should have.